So here's my clay model of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. The thalamus. It's a major sensory relay and integrating sensor in the brain. It lies deep within the central core, and it's consisting of two halves that receive sensory input from all types except for smell. Okay, here I've represented the two halves in more detail on the right side here. Alrighty, so let's see, camera focus. Alright. The thalamus is made up of paired egg-shaped masses of gray matter. Like I said, deep within the central core of the dicephalon, or the between brain. It lies on either side of the fluid-filled third ventricle, and it's connected to each other by a bridge of gray matter, the interthalamic adhesion. The front end of the thalamus is rounded and narrower than the back, which is expanded into the pulvinar. And here we have the pulvinar, and then we have the narrower front or anterior. Okay, the upper surface of the thalamus is covered with a thin layer of white matter, the stratum zonale, a second layer of white matter, the external medullary lamina, that's what that is representing there. Okay. These thalamic nuclear groups are separated by ventricle Y-shaped sheets of white matter. And the anterior nucleus lies in the fork of the Y. The tail divides the medial and the lateral nuclei and splits to enclose the intralaminar nuclei. All right, so there we have the internal medullary lamina, okay, which helps to control alertness. And then the dorsal medial nucleus, which integrates information about mood and instinct. The lateral posterior nucleus, which is involved in the integration of sensory information. The pulvinar, which integrates somatic sensations and auditory and visual information. Okay. The lateral posterior nucleus, that's involved in integration of sensory information. The lateral geniculate body relays visual information to the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex. The ventrolateral, and that's the yellow mound there, nucleus. And that's involved in the control of voluntary movement. And then the ventral anterior nucleus, which is involved in the control of voluntary movement as well. The thalamus is composed of a number of distinct nuclei. Each of these nuclei receives sensory input from the different sources, and as I stated, it is specific to the region of the brain. So that is the thalamus. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is, again, a complex structure located in the deep core of the brain, and it regulates fundamental aspects of the body and is critical for homeostasis and maintenance of equilibrium in the body's internal environment. The hypothalamus is a small region, again, in the dicephalon, It's about the size of a thumbnail, weighs only about 4 grams, lies below the thalamus, and separated from it by a shallow groove, the hypothalamic sulcus. All right, the hypothalamus is just behind the optic chiasm, the point where the two optic nerves cross over as they travel from the eyes toward the visual area of the back of the brain. Okay, the hypothalamus, just as a source of location, I've put the corpus callosum there at the top, and then there's space there to indicate the ventricle. All right. So here we have the paraventricular nucleus, and it synthesizes hormone oxytocin in females, which causes milk production in the mammary glands and contractions of the uterine walls during childbirth. Okay. And we have the dorsal medial and the ventral medial nucleus, which is concerned with the control of hunger and thirst. Okay. We have the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is concerned with controlling the sleep and wake cycle. And then below the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is the hormones released from the gland are under the distinct control of the hypothalamus. And the dark lines here represent the veins and the going in and out of the pituitary gland from the hypothalamus. Okay. So within the within the hypothalamus, we also have the supraoptic nucleus, which produces vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic or antidiuretic hormone, which increases water reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay. So then the pituitary gland we have the anterior pituitary, and the release of AP hormones is modulated by the sensory or stimulatory factors released by the hypothalamus. And we have the posterior pituitary, the PP. Hormones produced in the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei in the hypothalamus are secreted into the blood vessels here. And then in the middle, we have the median eminence. And several hypothalamic regulatory hormones are released into small blood vessels in the region of the median eminence. Okay. The hypothalamus regulates a wide range of basic processes, including the pituitary gland, the autonomic nervous system, where nerve fibers travel from the hypothalamus to the autonomic control center in the brainstem. And this influences heart rate, blood pressure, contractions of the gut and bladder, sweat and saliva. Also eating and drinking behavior. Stimulation of the lateral hypothalamus increases hunger and thirst. In contrast, activation of the ventral medial hypothalamus reduces hunger and food intake. Body temperature. Certain areas of the hypothalamus monitor the temperature of the body and act as a thermostat. Control of emotional behavior. The hypothalamus is involved, along with other brain regions, in the expression of fear and aggression, as well as in the control of sexual behaviors. And control of sleep cycles. The suprachiasmatic nucleus contributes to the daily pattern of sleeping and waking, as well as memory. Damage to the mammillary glands associated with impairments of the ability to learn or retain new information. So that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And that concludes my clay models of the brain, where we started with the medial view and then a lateral view of the left hemisphere. It dried up on me. Then we had the inferior view of the brain and the superior view of the brain. And then added the cerebellum, the pons, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. And last and definitely not least, the thalamus and the hypothalamus.